Good morning. My name is Rachel Schroeder. I'm a sophomore studying history at Hillsdale College. I am honored to introduce Emily Jashinsky, the culture editor at the Federalist and host of Federalist Radio Hour. I met Emily during my internship at the Luce Center, where she taught a journalism seminar to us interns. I never could have guessed coming into the Luce Center intern program that I would get to receive mentorship and one-on-one instruction from someone as accomplished yet down to earth as Emily. Knowing her became one of the highlights of my time at the Luce Center. Before her role at the Federalist, she covered politics as a commentary writer for the Washington Examiner. Prior to that, she was the spokeswoman for Young America's Foundation. She has interviewed leading politicians and entertainers and appeared regularly as a guest on television news programs, including Fox News Sunday, Media Buzz, and the McClellan Group. Her work has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, Real Clear Politics, and more. As director of the National Journalism Center, Emily offers students great paid internships. Emily is host of the Hill's weekly show, Rising Fridays, and is a visiting fellow at Independent Women's Forum. Originally from Wisconsin, she is a graduate of George Mason University. Please join me in welcoming Emily Jashinsky.
Well, that was very kind. It's great to see you, Rachel. It's great to see so many familiar faces here. It's always an honor to be here with you guys because I've told Michelle this. I think I was watching C-SPAN. This was around the 2008 election. I was in high school and I tuned in to a Luce panel and Michelle was on it. Kate was on it. I don't know where Kate went. She probably went to go get more coffee to get the Kate Obenchain energy level up. But it's just a real delight anytime I get to hang out with you guys here. Such important work. So I'm so grateful to Michelle. I'm grateful to the whole team and grateful to all of you guys for being here. Because you don't have to take time out of your weekends. I think all of Christendom College is here. You don't have to be here, but you are, and it's important, and it's really good that you are, and it's good for the future of the country. It's good for the future of all of your communities and your families. So I think it's amazing that you're here, and I'm proud of all of you for being here. Let me just start off by asking if any of you remember a man named Johnny Carson. You guys know? But do any of you guys remember Johnny Carson? All right, does the name sound familiar? Okay, all the heads are nodding. All right, great. Do you remember maybe your parents watching a guy named Jay Leno when you were growing up? All right, there we go. Okay, so that seems totally unrelated to the question of news media, which is what I'm here to talk about. Talking about the evolution of the news media, how it's gotten so bad. Why on earth would I be asking about these comedians? Well, it's really interesting that all of your heads nodded when I asked if you had heard of Johnny Carson. Even though, I wasn't really old enough to have ever seen Johnny Carson, but this is a household name, right? A fixture of American pop culture, hosted The Tonight Show for years and years and years, the same position that Jimmy Fallon is in now. Everyone knows Jimmy Fallon, right? Okay. So at the time, though, when Johnny Carson would do a show 5 days a week, the whole country basically was tuning in every night. Everybody who watched late night TV was watching Johnny Carson. Maybe they were just flipping there during commercial breaks, but there were only like 3 channels. And eventually when cable news came, it still was The Tonight Show. The Tonight Show was the thing that everybody was watching in late night comedy. Now, what does that mean for how Johnny Carson has to do his show? Think about that question as I go to Stephen Colbert. Everyone here knows Stephen Colbert, right? Okay. Stephen Colbert now hosts the late night show on CBS. He is rather inexplicably the top host in late night television. It's weird because Stephen Colbert is easily the least funny person on late night television, maybe on all of television, although he's competing with Trevor Noah, and that's a low bar, high bar, depending how you're looking at it. So Stephen Colbert, how is it that the least funny person on late night television is the most watched person on late night television? How can that possibly be? Does the country just suddenly have really bad taste in comedy? Well, part of the country probably does, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. And he's also, by the way, the most partisan host on late night TV. He approaches it very different from Fallon, very differently even from Kimmel, although Jimmy Kimmel's pretty political now too. But he's the most political and the most partisan host on late night TV. I should add one exciting caveat to that, which is that Greg Gutfeld regularly beats Stephen Colbert over on Fox News, which is amazing. And that's part of what we're all going to talk about. So just put a pin in that. We're going to come back to it, because what we're talking about here is really the business model of media and how it affects the content and the bias of media. So Johnny Carson to Stephen Colbert, that happens in just the course of a couple of decades. Well, when I asked the question earlier of how might the fact that just about the whole country was watching Johnny Carson influence the way that he came up with his show, ask the same question of Stephen Colbert. And consider that when Johnny Carson was doing his show 5 nights a week, you had probably something like 15 million plus nightly viewers. Stephen Colbert wins the ratings if he gets close to about 3 million viewers. Think about that. Think about what that means in terms of who is watching and how it affects the way we see ourselves and see each other. If the whole country is tuning in roughly to one late night TV show, what does that mean for the writers? It means Johnny Carson's writers had to sit down every single night and think, what is going to make America laugh tonight? When Stephen Colbert's writers sit down every single day, they have to think, what is going to make a small slice of highly partisan liberals laugh tonight? Because the way Stephen Colbert wins ratings is by cornering just a slice of the American population, right? You can't appeal to everyone anymore because not everyone is watching TV. There's so much choice. There's so many channels. There's Netflix. You could be watching Johnny Carson every night. You could be watching old episodes of it. You could be watching literally anything on Netflix, Hulu, HBO, all of the hundreds of cable channels. So the way to win the late night race is to corner a niche. Now think about that in terms of what it's doing to the country, and think about what it meant for Johnny Carson to think, what is going to make America laugh? It's an interesting project to sit down every single day and think, what is going to make the country laugh? And he didn't shy away from politics. It's not that he wasn't political at all. It's that his political jokes were seen as sort of like calling balls and strikes. We're gonna make fun of everyone, right? Equal opportunity mockery. And that really works. People are willing to hear that. Stephen Colbert just tells horrible partisan jokes, always at the expense of Republicans. Now, interestingly, this is totally paralleled by what's happening in the news media, because the business model is exactly the same. If you're sort of, and most of you are kind of sort of my age, I'm 29, so I was born in the early 90s. And the way that I think of these things is watching my parents put on Jay Leno. And that was kind of the normal thing to do. The nightly news, my parents still watch the nightly news. Maybe some of your parents do too. People our age do not watch the nightly news. Have any of you by of your own accord, sat down on the couch at 6 p.m. and nobody. Yeah, right. But that used to be what the country did. And it gave a few people a whole lot of power. Problem is, a lot of those people still have tons and tons of power. But think about the Johnny Carson versus Stephen Colbert. Think about it in terms of the New York Times versus something like the Daily Wire. Or even something like Fox News, which is older now. It's been around since the 90s, but it still kind of counts because it was part of that cable revolution. People my age, I think, tend to think of this idea of monoculture and mass media as the state of nature, right? Because it's all we've ever known. It's what it's always been like in this country if you're my age or a little bit older. The state of nature was just mass media. We were all watching similar things. And for people my parents' age, that was even more the case because it was just a few channels. It's just not the way things have been, though, in this country and in the history, certainly in the scope of human history. It's not always been like that. This is a very sort of deliberate world that was created by technologies, and technologies that we don't even think of as technologies because they predate us. But again, in the scope of human history, they are incredibly new. So that idea was of monoculture, of mass culture. When I say monoculture, what I mean by that is one kind of shared culture. It doesn't mean there aren't some kids off watching MTV or reading, the different magazines. They're not all reading Time. Maybe some people are reading Cosmo, maybe they're reading both. That doesn't mean it's not the case, but it meant that we had these touchstones because those were our only options, right? It's obviously not the case anymore, but this is all created by technologies like printing. Doesn't seem like a technology, right? But again, in the scope of human history, it's fairly new. Transportation. Did any of you see the Tom Hanks movie News of the World? Where it was his job to go from town to town in the West reading the news because people couldn't read, first of all, and you couldn't get that many papers to everybody's doorstep that quickly. People are getting news about, let's say, the Civil War weeks after what happened actually happened, but that's what they're relying on. They're relying on somebody to come from town to town and read a paper to them because we didn't have the technology to get papers to as many people that quickly. Isn't that interesting? I mean, that's not really that long ago. So transportation is just one part of these technologies. Think about radio, photography, which led to television. This all happened over the course of 100 or so years. Not printing, of course, but all of that sort of broadcast technology really unfolded over the course of, something like 100 years. Edward R. Murrow was a radio correspondent and left us in the age of TV. That might seem like, okay, no big deal. That's a huge deal. Those are two very, very different mediums, let alone from somebody who was born at a time when neither of them existed at that level. So what did that mean for the way the news got reported? Think about that. What is America going to be interested in tonight? Not what are my partisan viewers that tend to live in the same part of the country, tend to be highly educated, and tend to do a lot of the same, watch the same TV shows, watch the same movies, go to the same restaurants. What are they going to be interested in tonight? That is a very different way to do the news. So the New York Times, in the age of monoculture's sort of death, we've heard a lot about how mass media is dying. We've heard a lot about how local media is dying, and local media is dying, and that's a pretty bad thing, no matter how sort of liberal some of those papers are. They were sort of that connective tissue from communities to the national media, and now it's just owned by a few different corporations who outsource a lot of that journalism to people in big cities. So that's certainly part of the problem. But the New York Times, their project now is to report in a way that makes their subscriber base happy. The New York Times is not showing up on the doorsteps of readers around the country that need it to tell them what's happening in politics. They need, the Washington Post, USA Today, New York Times, any of those papers need to pick them up and hear what their White House correspondents are reporting back, right? That's just not the way it works anymore. It's all over Twitter. Nobody needs it. You can read the Daily Wire. Like I said, you think of the New York Times versus the Daily Wire. You could read what they're talking about because you trust their coverage better. Now, we're going to get into why you might trust their coverage better. And I think there are good reasons for that. But the fact of the matter is, we don't all rely on these few sources. So there's some advantages to that, and there's some disadvantages to that. But what ends up happening is the new media model is that people are really reliant on their individual subscriber bases, and those subscriber bases come from common kind of cultural points of view, and that ends up translating into the content and into the coverage, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so that's a hugely important way to think about all of this. And a friend of mine likes to talk about how we kind of fetishize mass media in this country. And I like to say, like, we think of it as the state of nature. It was not always the case. There were warring pamphlets, partisan pamphlets. If you go back to the revolutionary times, you should go look some of those up because they are hilarious. But when we freak out sort of about ABC's or NBC's really bad coverage now, go back then and see the way folks were talking about each other in print at the time. It was pretty harsh stuff. But that's the way things worked, right? Before we could kind of get everybody into the same place at the same time every single night and give them the news. So if you have to talk to a conservative in Kansas and a liberal in Manhattan as a news broadcaster, as a journalist, as a writer or a producer, how is that going to shape the way you think about what's worthy of coverage, right? One of the biggest biases in media is what's called selection bias. Does anyone know what that is? It's fairly self-explanatory, lots of heads nodding. Selection bias is impossible to get around. There's no such real thing as objectivity or neutrality. There's an aspiration for objectivity and neutrality, but you can never get around, for instance, what you decide goes on the front page, what you decide you lead off the nightly news with. You can never get around that. That's an editorial judgment. You are deciding what is important enough to make that point. All of these things, and when you're engaged in a project that has to appeal to people from vastly different political points of view, is a very different thing than what we see now. So for instance, the New York Times and the Washington Post, the failing New York Times, I should say, and the Bezos Washington Post, the New York Times actually isn't failing. Like Stephen Colbert, it's failing compared to what it did back in the day, right? Like, it is not on everybody's doorstep. So instead of getting those 15 million viewers a night, you're at that 3 million, right? And the same thing happened in the news media because it was all reliant on that business model of monoculture. But the New York Times is actually doing fairly well right now because they switched to a subscriber model that is working really well because they can get a bunch of the like NPR tote bag wealthy liberals in New York to give them their money. So here's a good example of what that means when it comes to coverage. You guys remember the story of the Tom Cotton op-ed in the middle of the summer of 2020? Okay, some heads nodding here. Just this week, Eric Wemple, a super liberal blogger and media critic over at the Washington Post, reflected on what happened in June of 2020 when the New York Times ran an op-ed from Senator Tom Cotton, mainstream Republican senator, with the headline that they gave it, "Send in the Troops." This is amid the riots of the summer of 2020, and what Tom Cotton wrote was very clear and unambiguous. He said, there is historical precedent for using the National Guard to quell violent riots. He did not say, sick the military on peaceful protesters. He said there is historical precedent for using the National Guard to quell riots. Now, this created a firestorm. The New York Times staffers tweeted in unison that publishing the op-ed puts, quote, Black NYT staffers in danger. Think about that. In danger. And they all tweeted that at the same time. So the New York Times yanks the column. They retracted the entire column from a Republican senator that they had published, that they had given the headline to. They pulled it. That is crazy. Crazy. And even now, you have somebody from the Washington Post saying that was the wrong decision. When Eric Wemple at the Washington Post looked back on what happened in the summer of 2020, this week, he said that was the wrong decision. And he's not a moderate. He's very far to the left. He's telling us this 2 years later, like we're supposed to give him a pat on the back, but it does speak to how insane a decision like that is. But the New York Times, I guarantee you, would do it again today. no matter what Eric Wemple thinks. Why is that? Because of exactly what we just talked about. They are now responsive to a very liberal subscriber base. So they don't care what middle America thinks about what's in the New York Times. They don't care what middle America thinks about their decision to retract an op-ed. They don't care what any Republican thinks because they are not subscribing to the New York Times. They're not their source of money and income. Does that make sense? So how is that going to influence the way that they cover things when we don't know what those editorial decisions are? They fired someone, one of their opinion editors, over this cotton op-ed. They made him the fall guy. His name is James Bennett. He is not conservative, far from it, but he had been told to publish heterodox views, to publish provocative views, and he got fired for publishing the mainstream opinion of a Republican senator. It's really crazy. And that's the difference. And it's a good illustration, I should say, of the difference between the New York Times and the Daily Wire. Both are doing the same thing, which is all any publication, any news media outlet can do anymore, which is create a niche audience and cultivate it. Again, advantages and disadvantages to this, to be sure. But the big difference between the New York Times and the Daily Wire is that the New York Times is not honest about what it's doing. And that's downstream of another huge issue that we're going to talk about in just a moment. But to emphasize and underline that a little bit, the New York Times claims to be objective and neutral. The Daily Wire does not. The Daily Wire says, hey, we're conservative. Or the Federalist, where I work, we say, hey, we're conservative. And we're going to go out here and do shoe leather investigative journalism. Is what we do at the National Journalism Center. We teach students that you can be conservative and you can be a reporter. You can uncover new facts and hold powerful people to account, and you can have a viewpoint. In fact, almost everybody has a viewpoint, and that's okay. Just tell your reader that. Be upfront and be honest about it. And that is why a lot of us trust, for instance, what we read in the Daily Wire more, right? You might have to think, well, let me go see what the New York Times is saying about this and weigh both points. But the New York Times is still lying to you and saying that they're just giving you the facts. It's not at all what they're doing. They're giving you the facts as hyper-liberal people want to read them and as they want to read them. And part of this is not a lie. And that's one of the, this is the sort of second component of what I'm talking about right now. So first we have the death of monoculture, and the second component of it is that even the people still claiming to participate in the monoculture, it's almost not a lie because they're so blinded to their own biases. The best book about journalism that has nothing to do with journalism, actually it is period the best book about contemporary journalism, it has nothing to do with journalism at all. It's called Coming Apart by Charles Murray. And what he documents in Coming Apart, which was reviewed really to praise, just kind of across the board, even in the liberal media, is how wealthy, educated elites are sorting into what he calls super zips. And there's a science to this. You can actually see how people are clustering in these like physical geographic regions at a higher concentration than ever before. And one of the first things we do at NJC is have people take the bubble quiz, which Charles Murray adapted from the social science behind his book. So it'll ask you things like, here's a good one. When somebody says the word Branson, what do you think of? Do you think of a wealthy billionaire mogul? Or do you think of a vacation destination in Missouri? All right, there we go. A couple different responses. So if you tend to be from a wealthier background, you're probably going to think of Richard Branson. If you are from a less wealthy background, you're probably going to think of Branson, Missouri. And actually education level now goes along with this really well. It goes along with wealth in the country super, super well. And you can really like pin this down. So here's a quote from Charles Murray. Across 14 of the most elite places to live in 1960, the median family income wasn't close to affluence. It was just $84,000 adjusted for inflation. Only 1 in 4 adults in those elite communities had a college degree. By 2000, that diversity had dwindled. Median family income had doubled to 163,000 in the same elite zip codes. The percentage of adults with BAs rose to 67% from 26%, and it's not just that elite neighborhoods became more homogeneously affluent and highly educated, they also formed larger and larger clusters. All right, so those super zips are where every single media outlet is based. These are not people that are eating at Cracker Barrel. These are not people that are watching Blue Bloods. And that sounds funny, but again, there's social science to that. It's really interesting how much our cultural tastes depend on where we live, how much money we make, and how well educated or not we are. And it has not always been like that in this country. So to Murray's point, if you're looking at 1960, even the most elite places to live were not affluent, as he puts it. How does that affect the coverage? Well, again, you have more of a monoculture, to be sure, but it means we also sort of shared values and touchstones, and we were neighbors. We were members of the same communities. We were invested in the same communities. That's a huge, huge, huge difference to where we are now. Huge difference to where we are now. And so every time you're reading something ridiculous in the New York Times, think about where it came from. It's really rooted deeply in that soil of elite sorting and education. So think about one really good example. The Associated Press decided years ago, that it was going to update its style guide, which is the standard style guide in media, period. Almost every single news outlet follows AP style, and everyone kind of puts their own version of AP style into practice, but everyone basically follows AP style. They literally write the book on grammar and all of that. So as the arbiter of appropriate grammar and style, the AP updated its guide years and years ago to say that you had to refer to women as men if that's how they identified. And so every paper, for the most part, dutifully followed suit. That is a decision being made by a tiny, tiny, tiny slice of the population that is affecting what is in every single newspaper, for the most part around the country, including local news, because they are owned by these corporate media conglomerations like Gannett that follow AP style. A tiny little slice of the population made that decision for everybody. And at the time, it may have been normalized in Brooklyn. It may have been normalized in Los Angeles or in Washington, D.C. It sure was not normalized in the rest of the country, right? That was radical. And it was coming from the arbiters of journalistic neutrality and objectivity. And that was them putting their thumb on the scale and saying, this is objective grammar. This is objective pronoun usage. And that was a very, very consequential decision that conditions the public to, again, think people in a position of power have evaluated the evidence and evaluated the arguments and come to a decision. That changes the way we think of these things, and it certainly changes the way we think of the issue because we're reading it that way. That would not happen if we lived in communities more like what Charles Murray is writing about in 1960, where there's a diversity of people from different backgrounds and different levels of wealth, different levels of education, living closer together and not sorting into these hyper elite bubbles where people have no idea what it's like to go to church every Sunday, to own a gun, to think differently about any kind of issue. And that's what happened in 2016 when Donald Trump won and everybody's bubble was just popped in the most spectacular way. How did they respond? Well, they thought for a couple of weeks, well, maybe the executive editor at the New York Times, Dean Boothe, said, we don't get religion. And the idea was to embark on this project of self-improvement. It lasted for like 2 weeks. And then they just like invented a conspiracy theory about Russian collusion that dominated the news cycle for a few years and distracted them from this noble project of self-improvement. And they actually got worse. If you didn't think, or if you thought, like I did, that the host of Celebrity Apprentice beating the former Secretary of State in a presidential competition that the media completely missed wouldn't be the thing. Like, if anything could fix the media that is in dire straits, it would be the host of Celebrity Apprentice becoming president. And it made them worse. Significantly worse every single day. So the only way through this really is out. They're not going to improve themselves. A lot of them care more about their ideology than about money. And that's a really important point when we're talking about, for instance, the Associated Press decision on pronouns and gender. Because they have this, what I've called the progressive or bigot binary formulation. And you guys are in college, you're in high school, but you've seen this on TikTok, you've seen it on Tumblr, you've seen it wherever, which is the idea that if you are not fully progressive with every single breath you take, you then fall on the bigot side, right? There are only two sides. You have to be fully progressive, and if you step out of line once, and if you think like J.K. Rowling, who is extremely far to the left on every single issue except for transitioning for minors, medical transitions for minors, and sports. The two things that this ultra-leftist is not on board with, if you disagree with them, they purge you because it makes you a bigot. They don't purge you because, they disagree with you. No, because if you step out of line, it's not just a fair-minded disagreement. It's an act of bigotry. It's potentially an act of violence, right? Think about what those New York Times staffers tweeted about the Tom Cotton op-ed. They said that op-ed put people in danger. When I was graduating college, they tried to make our YAF chapter, this was like my last semester in college, do mandatory pronoun training. Right. And the student newspaper called me up and was like, yeah, will GW YAF be requesting a religious exemption? And I was like, yeah, sure, that sounds good. They printed that in the student newspaper. And this is in 2015. They tried to get GWF suspended over that. The LGBT group on campus did. And they compared us to ISIS. And they said that we had committed an act of violence against the transgender community. So we don't even share consensus definitions of things like violence anymore. That is a scary place to be for a culture. There's a lot said about how we no longer agree on truth, and that's an important point. It's not just truth. Truth is sort of like the top of the pyramid. We have to think about sort of what comes downstream of that too. So if we can't agree on whether or not there is such a thing as objective truth and objective reality, we're not going to agree on what violence is, right? So as we started sending more and more students through that filter to adulthood, you're a kid, then you go through college, and then you can become an adult. That has become the standardized filter. So as we started sending more and more kids through that funnel, more and more people were hearing what the sort of postmodern philosophers, most of you guys go to good colleges, so you probably aren't forced to read a lot of like Foucault or Judith Butler or any of those folks, but these postmodern philosophers were attacking the concept of truth and reality. Nietzsche and Marx both wrote about it. There's the famous Marx quote about how religion is the opiate of the masses, right? Everyone's heard that. He was lamenting what that would mean for a society that didn't have that sort of opiate. That's not to say there's all these great things about Marx. It's to say, though, that in that period of industrialization where Marx and Nietzsche were writing, Nietzsche was really excited about it. He was like, this means we can all become our own gods and we can construct our own realities. But what he was observing is that this new sort of, as soon as you kill God, as Nietzsche said, God is dead and we killed him. As soon as you do that, you're killing truth. And when you kill truth, gradually, over the course of a couple generations, you get to where we are right now, where millennial reporters who have gone through the best schools in the country and are at the top of their profession think that they're put in danger by an opinion that is completely moderate and mainstream and reasonable. And when you combine that with the death of that sort of mass media model, it feels like things are spiraling really, really, really quickly. It's somewhat comforting to know at least where that came from, to know, okay, here's how we got here. But I mean, if you listen to The Daily, it's one of the most popular podcasts in the country. And if you listen to it, I know people actually like it because it summarizes the news of the day from the New York Times perspective. It's like listening to Rush Limbaugh, right? It's like listening to a liberal version of Rush Limbaugh. But if Rush Limbaugh thought that he was just calling balls and strikes, if he was just neutral and objective, and millions of people are listening to The Daily every single day. It's called The Daily. But when you understand that they think neutrality is that Tom Cotton is literally dangerous, that's their word, not mine. When you realize that they have been conditioned by their universities, by Hollywood, and by our culture to believe that you create your own truth and that your truth can be that you're put in danger by a mainstream, reasonable Republican senator, then you're going to use your platforms that you control because of the super zip sorting that we talked about. You're going to use those platforms, basically, to promote that worldview. And a whole lot of the country's not going to buy into it because they say that's ridiculous. It's not true. And when you purge everybody for dissent, this is an entirely different topic, but you become calcified, right? Nobody can pop your bubble, so there's no argument. And when there's no argument, a lot of really bad ideas metastasize and get much, much worse. So we're seeing a lot of that too. And that's another part of the problem. But when you do that and you say everybody that doesn't agree with me on this issue is a bigot, and you start promoting that through channels that claim to be speaking for the whole country neutrally, it's just ratcheting up the cultural tension in this country more and more and more. So the people who are honest about what they're doing in news media, that's good. But increasingly, the people who are claiming to be neutral are actually very, very, very far to the left. And it's that lie that is the most destructive thing in media right now. Obviously, that sort of distaste for truth or the disbelief in truth is the biggest problem. But when you don't believe in truth, you can say anything is neutral. And what they say is neutral is a very far left perspective. So, it's not the end of the world to have warring partisan news sources. The founding of the country kind of taught us that. We can do it. We can have partisan news sources that are fighting back and forth with each other and have that sort of clashing and clanging of ideas. And what shakes out is typically, in the marketplace of ideas, is typically the better idea on average. That's okay. We can work with that. But if we don't have a consensus on what truth is anymore, or whether truth even exists, and anyone can just claim they're being objective, and the people who happen to be doing that have a lot of money and power and influence, and more than everyone else, we're in a very dangerous space. So with that, thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take any other questions. Go ahead. You guys want him to go to the mic? Okay, yeah. Mic it up.
First, thank you so much for your talk. That was beautiful. It really hit home for me, you talking about everyone being in their bubbles, because I do have a very wide range of beliefs, and not my immediate family, but in cousins and stuff. And I do have cousins who I would say are completely different bubble than myself, and grew up going to schools in New York City, go to Ivy League colleges, and we have been able to have conversations, civil conversations, where we can share our points of view and really listen to each other. But if I was not cousins with her, there's no way we would have known each other, no way we could have been able to talk. And it just really has always puzzled me, like just even since high school, how can we reach out and, as you were saying, pop those bubbles and even start those conversations? Because with the bubbles and the wide variety of them throughout the country, it feels like sometimes you're just so isolated, you don't know how to connect.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wasn't sure if there were specific or practical ways in which we can pop those bubbles and have conversations with other people.
You know, this is a really practical tip, but I've always found that having a good sense of humor and like putting that foot forward is a really helpful way to have those conversations, because as long as you can be like self-deprecating and humble and realize that, hey, we're all fallen. You're not better than anyone else. But as long as you can kind of come to it with that perspective, I feel like it's more attractive to people to realize, hey, these crazy Christians might sort of practice what they preach, and I don't really know a lot of them, but this seems like, this is like a nice person, a genuinely nice person who's coming from a position of good faith. So I always, like, that's a small practical one. I've lived in a really deep blue city for the last 11, 12 years, but I'm originally from Wisconsin. So for me, it's just explaining it to people, you know, like, have you ever fired a gun? A couple of my friends from college fired a gun for the first time and cried. And I love to make fun of them for that because I just think it's so amusing. But that's like a very real difference. And it's probably not going to help me to laugh at them and mock them for crying when they fire of something that's very scary if you don't grow up around it. So just, I think, talking about those experiences and recognizing from your position how different that is, right? It just doesn't go one way. It's not just that they don't know how, we tend to know a little bit more about how they live because it's an everyday movie and TV show. But it's still different to grow up, in a city with no car. Think about that. It's kind of weird, right? And it's why they're so terrible on covering gas prices, because no journalists drive cars. It's just such an obvious thing. But recognizing that we're kind of in our own bubbles too. But coming to it with humility and a sense of humor on a practical level, I found can be helpful, and be willing to talk, be willing to debate. Conservatives do not have that problem because we are forced to do it every day of our lives now, and have very sharp, much sharper arguments. And I say that as somebody, again, who lives in a blue city and talks to a lot of those folks. But just be willing to have those arguments and be nice and kind, and that's a good foot forward, I guess. And listen to their stuff, watch their shows. One of the big things for me is when I realized when I was in high school, I loved The Office. And this is before it was on Netflix, which I feel like, again, feels like a state of nature. Like The Office on Netflix, like this is how God intended it. But when I was in high school, I realized that both of my parents went to college. I realized that The Office actually did not get big ratings. It was sort of dwarfed by shows like Blue Bloods. It was getting a few million people when it would air. I thought it was like the most popular show in the country because I watched it constantly, and people I knew watched it constantly. People whose parents had gone to college and were probably making roughly six figures, something like that. The country was not watching The Office at the time. Now they are. But there are certain things that are helpful touchstones just to know and be able to talk about.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk.
Hey.
My question is, do you think that the rise in partisan media is what, I guess, has really contributed to the polarization within a nation, or do you think it's the other way around, that's more of a symptom of polarization that was already happening within our culture and politics?
What came first, the chicken or the egg? I don't know. I think it's a really good question. I think it sort of all happened at the same time. I think what really we lose sight of is how rapidly technology has changed in general over the last century, maybe 2 centuries, but like a blink of the eye in the scope of human history, We are eating and working and communing in dramatically different ways than we ever have as a species, frankly, and we're not used to it. And so I think a lot of it is when the period of industrialization happened, that's where you see a lot of these postmodern philosophies starting to blossom to the surface in ways that they haven't in human history, right? Like we can go back and there were very, very few people denying the concept of objective truth. That starts catching on with elites in the period of industrialization, and as it sort of caught on with elites and we sent more people to those schools, it's caught on en masse. And so I tend to put it more at that, but obviously as we're industrializing, our media technology is shifting too. So I think it's just all kind of happened at the same time, and it definitely makes it much, 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 much worse because a lot of the country still is clinging to common sense because it's common sense, and we know that truth exists. We don't need to be told by Sartre or Foucault that it's all a lie. We know that it exists, and so it's definitely causing tensions, but you guys know this better than I do. It's one of the things that I tell people all the time. Gotta have compassion for so many people, especially your age, who have been conditioned for years and years and years by Hollywood and the news media to see a world of my truth. Not the truth, and it's very, very hard to come out of that when it's everything, the air that you breathe for your entire lifetime. So when people are easily kind of sucked into these trends, the mothers that I've talked to, the kids that I've talked to that got sucked into sort of the trans ideology and have physical scarring, not just psychological, but both because of that, it just goes to show this can really happen to anybody because it is so prevalent in our culture. So that's a point I'll end on, and I'll also say I'm super excited to hear Kate. She's laughing. Kate, I said this at the beginning. It was a Luce panel in like 2008 with you and Michelle that first got me like to even Google all of this stuff. Yeah. What I mean by that is you're old, Kate. I was 14. I'm kidding. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.